Well, obviously, terrorism and all these disturbing stories and issues remain at the top of mind for many politicians here on Parliament Hill, especially after the October 22nd terror attack that we faced here in Ottawa. So the questions being, how vulnerable are Canadians? And today, the shocking news of a 15-year-old. So how vulnerable are our kids? Joining us with their view from the Hill is our Thursday MP panel from the Conservative Party. We have Stella Ambler, MP for Ontario. We have the NDP's Robert Chisholm, MP from Nova Scotia. For the Liberals, Scott Sims, MP from Newfoundland and Labrador. And of course, from the Green Party, we have the Green Party's leader, Elizabeth May. This is a really stunning story because of the age of the young man involved. We've heard of lots of young people being radicalized. This is a 15-year-old. And that's why we can't identify him, of course, because he is underage, so his identity is protected. Is this the reason why some of the changes were needed to the terror laws that have been brought in? Because he is the first person to be arrested under these laws in Canada. One other person was charged, but that individual had already left the country. So he is somewhere in the Middle East involved with one of these terror organizations, allegedly at this point. The first arrest. Is the government satisfied?
I think, yeah, this is a clear demonstration that we needed this law. It was passed a few years ago in my term and earlier in this Parliament, and it's clear from what we know of this case. This is a young man who's allegedly committed armed robbery in order to get enough money to go to Syria, to join ISIL and probably commit some horrific acts and possibly murder. This is someone who was upset to be, according to documents found on his computer apparently, upset to be living in a country that was not governed by Sharia law. So, I think it clearly demonstrates that this new law, Combating Terrorism Act, is working.
Robert?
I think we've become increasingly aware of the fact that the radicalization of young Canadians is a real problem. It's a serious concern, and we've been calling on the government to, to take more measures, working with the provinces, working with communities, in order to begin to address this this serious issue. There's no doubt about it. I understand it was latter part of September the 24th when the Somali community organizations came forward and actually identified some youth that they felt were at risk of being radicalized. That's the kind of cooperation that we increasingly need to pay attention to. And let me say, on the work of the law enforcement officials on the ground, our concern is more the level of resources that our police have, our law enforcement officials have on the ground. There have been some devastating cuts over the past few years, and that's what we hear out there when we're talking to people about their ability to keep our community safe.
Elizabeth, I know that you're always very sensitive to the balance between civil liberties, which are extremely important, and terrorism laws. When you look at this scenario, are you satisfied with the terrorism laws? Do you think that there are things that could be done better?
Well, right now, first of all, I have to say, Mercedes, I can't characterize October 22nd as a terror attack on Parliament Hill. We had one mentally ill, drug-addicted individual. Thank God he wasn't really in a terrorist organization and equipped with serious weaponry. He had an practically ancient Winchester 30-30, and thank goodness we are much more aware of security on Parliament Hill, because had that person been equipped with the kind of weapons that, if a real, we would have been in much more serious tragedy.
Is that what determines a terrorist attack, how sophisticated the weapons are?
No, it's if they're in a terror organization. If they're mentally ill and attracted to the notion of terrorism, that is, to me, important to distinguish, because if you say that was a terrorist attack or ISIL has reached into Ottawa, you're giving bragging rights to an organization overseas that we don't know had anything to do with it. In fact, we think not. We think that the isolation of that individual, or in the case of the young man who ran down Patrice Vincent, we know, similar to this case, and this is significant, it was a parent who went to the police. The police had been notified about the unbalanced nature of the young man who eventually ran down and killed Patrice Vincent, because his father went to them and said he was concerned. In this case, all we know so far is that a father has said that his son was committing armed robbery with a desire to go overseas to fight with terrorists, clearly drawn into the orbit of the idea that this is how he wants to risk his life, waste his life, do something horrific. Does that make it part of a terrorist attack? I mean, think about how terrified people were in Moncton when 3 Mounties were killed and the killer was at large in the community overnight. Being terrified doesn't make it a terror attack. I think we have to be careful with our language, because I don't want to either give credit to terrorist organizations or lose sight of the fact that maybe what we need more is mental health counseling, programs that assist youth and help people with drug addictions.
Scott, should be focusing on mental health counseling, or do you think that there's some cases where these kinds of very tough terror laws are necessary?
Well, in this particular case, I mean, there's still a lot of details have to come. So we have to, one thing that we have to do is not overreact in the very beginning. I agree with many things of what she's saying, but the mental health of any particular individual has to be gauged, and we need to look at our current laws as they stack up against fighting terror organizations. If I just may bring in a political element to this, one of the things we have to do as not just government but Parliament is to vet new legislation regarding terrorists and how we deal with terrorist organizations. But the vetting process has to take place amongst all members of Parliament, all of us who are duly elected, 308. And that requires a vetting of legislation that would also use amendments, certain amendments that we propose that we hope that the government will listen to us and do this. I don't see a lot of that happening. Well, amendments like the amendments we just talked about. And there's certain, when it comes to certificates and other measures, there are many ideas that we have, and we have a broad spectrum of opinion in our House. I mean, we do have different ideologies and different ideas about how things are done. But if we don't address all of this in a serious issue like terrorism, then we're going to be left with laws that they're grossly inadequate.
Yeah, and the other thing I'd say, Mercedes, I think that I mean, it's too early to say whether in this instance, I mean, I think we need to have laws, and I'm not against a law that says that if somebody's expressing a desire to travel overseas for the purpose of committing terrorism, yes, by all means, take their passport. But we also need the programs, what do we do with them? The fact that Patrice, the killer of Patrice Vincent, that his father went to the police, that he was known to police, and that the only thing they could think of to do was take his passport. Surely we need programs, and this term of radicalization, whatever it is, this is a sign of someone calling out that something is unbalanced and wrong in their lives. We better get them into the kind of treatment, counseling, de-radicalization, whatever you want to call it, that makes them not a threat and not a risk to life and limb and security.
There are about 90 people that CSIS is watching. Those are people who've been overseas and come back. We don't know beyond that. We don't know if this young man was one of them.
That's right.
Is it a sign, though, that the appeals of law enforcement and, to a certain extent, the government are working? It has to be so difficult for a father to make the decision to turn in his own son, knowing he will face what are very serious criminal charges. He could have a record for the rest of his life. But the other alternative is this is a 15-year-old who's going overseas and could be killed with a terror organization, allegedly.
Right. Yeah. I mean, these are the questions that I'm sure haunted this poor man before he did this, and there's no doubt that we're talking about mental illness regardless. I agree with that. I will say, though, respectfully, I disagree. I believe it was a terror attack. I think that when someone is targeting a soldier, someone in uniform, he walked by many plainclothes, ordinary citizens that day because he didn't care about them. He was, he targeted the soldier at the cenotaph, and then we find out later that the reason he came to Parliament Hill was because he wanted to, behead a Canadian politician or something like that.
I'm going to change gears here because I know we could debate the definition of terrorism extensively. Even in academia, there is a big conflict over what it is. But I want to switch gears a bit to another hot topic, and that's been veterans that we've been talking about a lot. A story today that a number of veterans advocates who work in the mental health field think that the announcement that the government made of the additional $200 million is insufficient, saying some of it is programs that already existed. These are people who aren't political. They work on the ground with vets on a daily basis in rehabilitation programs at the University of Alberta and in Victoria, coming out in a Globe and Mail article by Gloria Galloway and saying it's not enough. So, Stella, I'll go to you first, even though we were just talking to you, because you're the government on this.
Yeah, happy to clarify. It's $200 million new dollars booked over 6 years for 8 new operational stress injury clinics across Canada, as well as other
but there's
mental
also supposed
illness,
to be new money for research, and they're saying it's not
part
new.
of it is. Part of it is for research, part of it is for a comprehensive plan for mental illness. This is in addition to $500 million that the Auditor General reported was spent in the last,
that is what's
by the end of the last
every year on mental health. So my question for you, why can't you just spend more money on veterans? Wouldn't it make this go away?
Let me say this. there is $30 billion since 2006. So I mean, sure, that's a lot of money. The dollar amounts don't really matter when you're talking about even one veteran. No one wants even one not to get the care that they deserve and that they require, especially in the field of mental illness, which is a growing area.
Absolutely,
we know because
with the number of Afghan veterans coming home. Robert, is it enough money?
Look, this government has been insulting veterans and members of the Canadian Forces now for a number of years. They're trying to sell them a bill of goods, and what you heard today with the advocates coming out again is that, the government is just spinning this, as they have said. I mean, they're in court, if you can imagine, they're in court in British Columbia trying to tell veterans that they don't have any social contract with veterans as a government. They're fighting a vet that had his legs blown off above the knee.
Mark Campbell. Defending
Canada. And representing us in the Canadian Forces. It takes 8 months. The Auditor General said it takes 8 months for someone, for a vet to not only be identified as needing services, but to begin to receive those services. It's just simply not good enough. We already know that the government, didn't spend $1.6 billion of their budget last year. It goes on and on.
Elizabeth?
They're simply not up to the snuff when it comes to providing services, not only for veterans, but also for Canadian Forces members.
I just say, I agree with Robert, but it's not, Julian Fantino's drawing a lot of heat on this right now, but I think it's the record of the Harper administration. It's not just Julian Fantino. You start with what they called the Veterans Charter of Rights, which took away the right for a veteran to receive a lifetime of checks to help someone who's been disabled and wounded. And that is, of course, an insult to veterans. We have court case after court case where they have to fight for their rights. I was talking to a wonderful veteran who was the first one to get, for PTSD, for post-traumatic stress disorder, to get his own service dog, helping save lives. But there's such a wait list for veterans who want these service dogs. And I asked Julian Fantino in the House, point blank, is this for 6 years of funding or 50 years? How long is this $200 million going to be programmed? Over what time period? Didn't get a straight answer out of him that day. So I think there's still questions about whether this is not just really $200 million or spread out over 50 years.
Well, the document showed that it was over 50 years.
Yeah. Well, and now the government is saying that it's over 6 years. They called us while we were on the air earlier this week. We got a government source who said it is, in fact, over 6 years, unless it's not all spent over 6 years. Scott, I do want to go to you because the Liberals raising questions about the amount of money that's being spent on veterans' graves as well.
Yeah, well, the irony of it is, I mean, here's a minister who travels to Italy to visit one of these underfunded grave sites that we're talking about. There are many of them around the world, and we're just catching up to this now, to finding out what is going on. It also reminds me of the underfunding, like in the case of the 9 service centers. I've had so many veterans say to me that it is such an insult to them, because now they're folding this into what is a bureaucracy that are just not used to dealing with veterans, and that makes a difference. These 9 centers were specialized in doing it, and now all of a sudden that is away. So in all the grandiose, we just saw there were many grandiose announcements since 2006 of $1 billion, and $1 billion not even spent. So all this is grandiose announcement
with advertising. We just have about 30 seconds left, but I do want to give the opportunity to Stella to respond, since she's been had 3 people here to deal with.
I appreciate that, and no, this is not about denying anyone. I mean, any veteran who comes home to Canada and as a result of their service needs care is going to get it. And so this is not, if anything, the Auditor General's report, which we asked for because we wanted to know where the gaps were, and we're addressing them. We're addressing them by
confirmed that vets that need it,
huge
Stella,
amounts,
are not
huge
getting
dollar
the services, and that is the issue.
There are vets who are homeless.
That's the issue.
There are, and certainly it's something the government has to deal with, says they're dealing with.
Absolutely.
We'll keep an eye on how well they're dealing with it.
We want to address it. We don't want anyone to suffer.
You all coming on today and sharing your opinion on these very important stories.
Thanks.